Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we uncover the quiet Missouri morning when Jesse James finally let his guard down and the man he trusted most put a bullet in his back for reward money. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. There is a house still standing on Lafayette Street in St. Joseph, Missouri. It is a small house, white-framed, sitting quietly at the edge of a bluff that overlooks the slow brown curl of the Missouri River. The rooms inside are modest. The ceilings are low. The floorboards have been worn smooth by 140 years of careful footsteps, of tourists moving through in reverent silence, of schoolchildren peering into corners and trying to imagine what it might have felt like to live inside a name as large as the one that filled every room of that house in the spring of 1882. Tonight, let that house be the place where your thoughts come to rest. Let the world outside grow quiet. Let your body settle into whatever surface holds you now. Feel the weight of the blanket, the coolness of the pillow against the side of your face. Breathe slowly. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing that needs deciding tonight. We are going to a particular Monday. The 4th of April, 1882. A morning when the light came in through an east-facing window and fell across a dusty floor, and a man stood on a chair to straighten a picture on the wall, and the whole enormous story of an American legend arrived, quietly and irreversibly, at its end. Part 1: The Myth Before the Man. Before we reach that Monday morning, before we enter that small house on Lafayette Street, we need to understand what kind of weight a name can carry. We need to understand how a man becomes something larger than himself. How the stories people tell about a life can grow so wild and so wide that the actual human being living inside them becomes almost invisible, even to himself. The name Jesse James had, by the spring of 1882, become something extraordinary in American life. It was a name printed in newspapers from Boston to San Francisco. It was a name spoken in barbershops and around supper tables and in the halls of state legislatures. It was a name that meant different things to different people, depending on who was doing the speaking and where they stood in relation to the war that had reshaped everything about the country in the decade before Jesse James began robbing banks. To the editors of certain newspapers, particularly those sympathetic to the old Confederate cause, Jesse James was something approaching a folk hero. A man who had fought on the losing side of a terrible war and had never quite been allowed to come home. A man who stole from railroads and banks, yes, but those railroads and banks were themselves instruments of a new order that had dispossessed thousands of Missouri farm families after the war. There was a story ready-made for him, and the newspapers helped write it. The Robin Hood story. The noble outlaw story. The story in which Jesse James was not a criminal but a rebel, not a thief but a protest made flesh. To the Pinkerton Detective Agency, to the railroad companies and express companies who had been robbed again and again across 2 decades, to the lawmen who had chased him across Missouri and Kansas and Kentucky and Minnesota, Jesse James was something entirely different. He was a problem. A dangerous, elusive, expensive, humiliating problem. He was a man who had made organized law enforcement look slow and clumsy and corrupt. He was a man who seemed to move through the landscape of the American Midwest like smoke, arriving without warning, disappearing without trace, leaving behind emptied safes and dead witnesses and the lingering, infuriating impression that he could not be caught. And to his own family, to his wife Sorelda and their 2 small children, to his mother back on the farm in Clay County, Jesse James was something else again. He was a husband who came home in disguise. A father who could not tell his children his real name. A son whose existence placed everyone who loved him in permanent danger. He was a man living in a kind of compressed, airless freedom, free in the sense that he was not behind bars, but imprisoned by everything that freedom had cost him. It is useful to hold all three of those versions in mind as we move through this story. Because the night Jesse James met his end was not simply the end of a criminal. It was the end of a myth. And the ending of a myth is always a more complicated thing than the ending of a man. Jesse Woodson James was born on the 5th of September, 1847, on a farm in Clay County, Missouri. His father, Robert James, was a Baptist minister, a man of education and quiet conviction who helped found what would eventually become William Jewell College before dying of fever in California in 1850 when Jesse was barely 3 years old. His mother, Zerelda, was a strong-willed, deeply partisan woman who would outlive her son by decades and spend those decades tending his legend with the same fierce attention she had once given to tending his wounds. Clay County, Missouri in the 1840s and 1850s was hemp and tobacco country. It was also, crucially, slave-holding country. The James family owned slaves. They were not wealthy planter aristocrats, but they were comfortable, and their comfort was built on the same foundation as the comfort of thousands of other Missouri farm families. When the war came, the divisions it created were not simply geographic. They ran through towns, through churches, through families. They ran, in some cases, through the same households. By 1864, Jesse was 16 and old enough to ride with Bloody Bill Anderson, another guerrilla leader who made even Quantrill look restrained. Jesse participated in at least one massacre during this period, at Centralia, Missouri, where Anderson's men ambushed a company of Union soldiers returning from leave. The precise nature of Jesse's involvement in the worst of what happened that day has been debated by historians for a century and a half, but there is no serious doubt that he was present, that he participated in combat, and that what he witnessed and did in those months shaped him in ways that would never fully heal. When the war ended in 1865, Jesse James was 17 years old, recovering from a serious chest wound, and belonging to the losing side of the largest conflict the North American continent had ever seen. He could not go home to Clay County and simply become a farmer. The guerrillas who had ridden with Quantrill and Anderson were not offered the generous surrender terms that Robert E. Lee had been granted at Appomattox. They were expected to sign loyalty oaths, to surrender their weapons, to submit to the authority of a government they had spent 4 years trying to destroy. Some of them did. Many of them found it impossible. Jesse James found it impossible. And so, within a year of the war's end, he had begun what would become a 16-year career of robbery and flight that would make his name the most famous outlaw name in American history. But here is the thing worth sitting with in the quiet of tonight. The myth of Jesse James did not come from Jesse James. It came from a culture that needed him. It came from a defeated people who needed a story in which one of their own was still fighting, still winning, still refusing to surrender. It came from the newspapers, particularly from a Kansas City editor named John Newman Edwards, who had ridden with the Confederate General Joe Shelby and who spent years writing pieces in the Kansas City Times that portrayed Jesse James not as a criminal but as a knight-errant of the lost cause. Edwards and James were, in a sense, collaborators. James occasionally sent letters to the newspapers, letters that Edwards would publish, in which Jesse protested his innocence of various crimes or explained his actions in terms designed to make him sound like a political prisoner rather than a robber. It was an extraordinary performance of public image management, one that would not look out of place in the media landscape of any century. And so by 1882, the name Jesse James occupied a space in the American imagination that very few names ever reach. He was simultaneously a real human being, a wanted fugitive with a price on his head, a husband eating breakfast with his family, a man who sometimes coughed in the night from the lung damage that old chest wound had left behind, and also a legend, a story, a symbol, an argument about the Civil War and Reconstruction and the character of the American West that thousands of people felt deeply and personally invested in. The man and the myth had become nearly impossible to separate. And both of them, on a quiet Monday morning in April of 1882, were living in a small rented house on Lafayette Street in St. Joseph, Missouri, under the name of Thomas Howard. Part 2: The Long Road to St. Joseph. There is something almost cinematic about the way the years before 1882 accumulate. Each robbery, each escape, each narrow miss, each newspaper story seems to be building towards something, though no one involved could have said exactly what. The James Younger Gang, as it came to be called, operated across the better part of 16 years, robbing banks and trains and stagecoaches across a wide arc of the American Midwest and South. And yet by the early 1880s, the world around them had changed in ways that made their continued existence as outlaws increasingly difficult. The robberies had begun in 1866, with a bank in Liberty, Missouri, which remains to this day the first daylight bank robbery in American history during peacetime. The men who rode into Liberty that cold February morning were mostly former guerrillas, men who had spent the war years mastering the art of riding fast and shooting accurately and intimidating civilians into silence. The techniques they had learned in wartime service translated with terrible efficiency into peacetime crime. Through the late 1860s and the 1870s, the gang robbed banks across Missouri, Kentucky, and Iowa. They robbed trains, which became their signature crime, stopping locomotives on isolated stretches of track and forcing passengers and crew to hand over cash and valuables while one or two men went to work on the safe in the express car. They were bold. They were organized. And for years, they seemed genuinely uncatchable. The Pinkerton Detective Agency, hired by the express companies, made several attempts to infiltrate the gang and failed. In January of 1875, Pinkerton agents threw an incendiary device through the window of the James family farmhouse in Clay County, apparently believing Jesse and Frank were inside. They were not. The explosion killed Jesse's younger half-brother, Archie Samuels, who was 8 years old, and destroyed his mother Zerelda's right arm. The incident created a public relations disaster for the Pinkertons and, paradoxically, increased sympathy for the James family throughout Missouri. It was exactly the kind of episode that John Newman Edwards had been waiting for, and he used it to devastating effect in his newspaper columns. The turning point in the gang's fortunes came in September of 1876 with the raid on the First National Bank in Northfield, Minnesota. It was, by any measure, a catastrophe. The citizens of Northfield fought back. Armed residents opened fire on the gang from buildings along the main street. 3 outlaws were killed during the robbery itself. Most of the surviving gang members, including 3 of the younger brothers, were captured within weeks by a massive manhunt that stretched across southern Minnesota. Only Frank and Jesse James managed to escape. They escaped into a kind of exile. For nearly 3 years after Northfield, Jesse and Frank James were almost entirely invisible. They moved from state to state. They lived under assumed names. They kept company with a small circle of people they trusted, which grew smaller with every passing year as the pressures of that life took their toll. Jesse's wife Zerelda, whom he called Z to distinguish her from his mother, and their children traveled with him, living in rented houses in communities where no one knew their real names, trying to approximate the shape of an ordinary life. The family settled, for periods, in Tennessee. Jesse operated for a time under the name J.D. Howard. He tried, or appeared to try, to distance himself from crime. But the rewards for his capture were growing. The railroad companies and express companies were pouring money into the effort to bring him in. And the circle of men he could trust to ride with him had narrowed dramatically since Northfield. By 1879, Jesse had begun assembling a new gang from less experienced men. These men were more difficult to control, more prone to loose talk, more susceptible to the growing rewards being offered for information. The new gang robbed a train at Glendale, Missouri in October of 1879, and several trains after that. The robberies were competent enough, but the atmosphere around them had changed. The men riding with Jesse James were not veterans of Quantrill's raiders. They were younger, more desperate, less disciplined. The Glendale gang included a set of brothers named Ford. Charlie and Bob Ford. Charlie Ford had ridden with Jesse on at least one train robbery and had developed a relationship with him that was close enough to be called a friendship, or at least the kind of wary mutual dependence that sometimes passes for friendship among men living outside the law. Bob Ford was younger, more ambitious, and considerably more calculating. By the autumn of 1881, the James gang had committed a train robbery at Blue Cut, Missouri, which many newspapers reported as one of the most audacious of Jesse's career. It was also one of the last. The political landscape in Missouri had shifted. A new governor, Thomas Crittenden, had taken office in 1881 and made the capture or killing of Jesse James the signature project of his administration. Crittenden negotiated with the railroad and express companies to fund a reward that exceeded what the state's legal limits would normally have permitted, $10,000 for Jesse James, dead or alive. $10,000 in 1882 was an enormous sum. It was more than most working men in Missouri would earn in a decade. It was the kind of money that could transform a life. And it was the kind of money that could make a man reconsider every loyalty he thought he had. Bob Ford had been thinking about it for months. He had made contact with the governor's representatives in early 1882, and a plan had been quietly forming. The plan required something specific: access. Access to Jesse James at a moment when Jesse James could not defend himself. For that, Bob Ford needed to be in Jesse's trust, and he needed to be close. In early 1882, Jesse James had moved his family to St. Joseph, Missouri. He had rented a small house on the hill above the city, a house that sat at the end of a modest residential street and offered a clear view of the roads approaching it. He was living there under the name Thomas Howard. His neighbors thought he was a wheat farmer. His children played in the yard. His wife cooked on the stove. And in the house, planning what he hoped would be one more robbery before he retired to a quieter life, Jesse James was making preparations with the Ford brothers. Charlie Ford was already staying in the house. Bob Ford visited regularly. The three of them were planning a bank robbery in Platte City, not far away. Jesse trusted the Fords, or trusted them as much as Jesse James trusted anyone, which was never completely, never without the careful wariness that 16 years as a hunted man had built into every interaction. But trust, in those final weeks, was the one thing Jesse James was running short of. And somewhere across the city, in the offices of people he did not know or watching, the arrangements were quietly being made for a Monday morning that would change everything. Part 3, St. Joseph in the spring of 1882. There are places that carry their history visibly, in their architecture and their street plans and the stories their oldest residents still tell. St. Joseph, Missouri, in the spring of 1882, was exactly such a place, though in ways that were still unresolved, still contested, still in the middle of becoming something. St. Joseph sat on the western edge of Missouri, on a high bluff above the Missouri River, looking out toward Kansas and the plains beyond. It had been, in the 1850s and 1860s, one of the great jumping-off points for westward migration. The California emigrants had outfitted here. The gold rush travelers had crossed the river here. And most famously, for 18 months in 1860 and 1861, the Pony Express had begun its remarkable overland mail service from St. Joseph, carrying letters and dispatches to Sacramento in 10 days or less, before the telegraph made the whole enterprise obsolete. By 1882, the Pony Express was already a legend, one of those short-lived American enterprises that become more romantic in retrospect than they ever were in practice. St. Joseph had moved on. It had grown into a substantial city of perhaps 30,000 people, a commercial center and railroad hub that served the agricultural wealth of the surrounding plains. There were churches and hotels and a newspaper, the Gazette, and a lively commercial district along the river bluffs. There were also saloons and gambling halls and the constant low-level commerce of a city that sat at the meeting point of several important roads. The house that Jesse James rented that spring sat on a lot at 1318 Lafayette Street, on a quiet residential hill a little removed from the busier streets closer to the river. It was a story-and-a-half frame house, white-painted, with green shutters and a small porch. Inside there were 5 rooms, a parlor, a dining room, a kitchen on the ground floor, and 2 bedrooms above. The ceilings were low enough that a tall man would want to be careful near the light fixtures. The floors were bare wood in most rooms, with a modest rug in the parlor. There was a small stable behind the house where Jesse kept his horses. The house had what local accounts would later describe as a commanding view. It sat at a height that made it easy to see anyone approaching along the roads below. This was not accidental. Jesse James, whatever else he was a man who had survived as long as he had through a combination of physical courage, quick thinking, and extreme attention to the geography of any space he occupied. He chose houses the way he had once chosen ambush positions, with an eye to sightlines and exit routes. The April of 1882 came early and warm to St. Joseph. The Missouri was running high with snowmelt from the mountains far to the northwest. The trees along the bluffs were beginning to show the first pale green of new leaves. The mornings were cool enough to warrant a fire in the kitchen stove, but by midday the sun was strong enough to make the wooden siding of the house warm to the touch. Inside that house, in the weeks before the 4th of April, the atmosphere was one of an ordinary family life maintained under conditions that were anything but ordinary. Jesse and Z. James had been married since 1874, a marriage that had been conducted in secrecy, celebrated quietly among a small circle of trusted family members. They had 2 children, Jesse Edward, who was 8 years old that spring, and Mary Susan, who was 5. The children knew their father as Thomas Howard. They may or may not have understood that the name was not his own. Z. James, in the accounts that survived from people who knew her, was a woman of considerable quiet strength. She had chosen to marry a man who could not offer her safety or stability, who could not tell her honestly where they would be living next year or whether he would be alive to see another spring. She had made that choice with open eyes, and she had spent the years since then doing what was necessary to keep her family together and her children as close to a normal life as circumstances allowed. What did those weeks feel like from the inside of that house? There is no way to know with certainty. But there are traces. There are the accounts of neighbors who remembered seeing a quiet, well-dressed family who kept mostly to themselves. There are the recollections of Bob Ford and, later, Charlie Ford, who both described the atmosphere in the house as tense in ways that were difficult to name but impossible to ignore. Jesse was not sleeping well. He was, by multiple accounts, more suspicious than usual, more alert to small irregularities, more likely to stand at a window and watch the street below for longer than any particular reason seemed to require. He had begun to feel something. Whether it was the particular instinct of a man who had spent 16 years reading danger the way other men read weather, or simply the accumulated anxiety of a life lived permanently on the edge, something was telling Jesse James that the walls were closing. He talked about it obliquely, in the way that men of his time and temperament talked about things they were not quite ready to name directly. He talked about wanting to retire, about making one more score and then finding a way to live quietly somewhere far from Missouri. He talked about his children, about what he wanted for them, about the kind of father he wanted to be. The Ford brothers were in and out of the house during those weeks. Charlie Ford was essentially living there, sleeping in an upstairs room, sharing meals with the family. Bob Ford visited regularly. They were discussing the Platte City Bank, talking through the plan, working out the details that would need to be worked out before they could move. But Bob Ford was also, in those same weeks, conducting a second set of conversations, far away from Lafayette Street. He was meeting with Elias Ford, the Clay County Sheriff, and with other representatives of Governor Crittenden's administration. The arrangement was clear: Bob Ford would deliver Jesse James to justice, and in exchange, Ford would receive a portion of the $10,000 reward and would be given immunity from prosecution for his own role in the gang's recent activities. The plan, as Bob Ford conceived it and as the governor's representatives understood it, was not necessarily for Jesse to be killed. It was possible that Ford could arrange a situation in which Jesse could be captured, arrested, brought in alive. But Ford was clear-eyed about the probabilities. A man like Jesse James, alert and armed and vastly experienced, was not likely to submit to arrest. And there was also the simpler calculation that a dead Jesse James was considerably less dangerous to Bob Ford than a living one. And so St. Joseph, in the mild, greening spring of 1882, held within its ordinary grid of streets and its ordinary rhythms of commerce and church and river commerce, a situation that was already resolved, already moving toward its conclusion. The only question was the precise shape of the final moment. Outside the White House on Lafayette Street, the morning of April the 4th was becoming clear and bright. Inside, a family was beginning their day. A fire was lit in the kitchen stove. Breakfast was being prepared. And somewhere in the spaces between the ordinary and the extraordinary, the last morning of Jesse James's life was quietly assembling itself. Part 4: The Men Who Came In from the Cold. To understand the morning of April the 4th, we need to sit with the Ford brothers a little longer. We need to understand who they were before they became the two names most permanently associated with the end of Jesse James. Because they were not simply hired killers or government agents. They were something more complicated and more human than those categories suggest. Charlie Ford was the elder of the two brothers who were directly involved in the events of that morning. He was in his middle 20s in 1882, a quiet, somewhat nervous man who had grown up in Ray County, Missouri, not far from Clay County where Jesse James had been born. The Ford family was not wealthy, not prominent, not particularly distinctive among the scores of similar farm families in that part of Missouri. Charlie Ford had drifted into the orbit of the James gang the way that many young men in Missouri drifted into such orbits in the years after the war, through proximity, through acquaintance, through the accumulated weight of a regional culture in which Jesse James was spoken of as a near-legendary figure. Charlie had ridden with Jesse on at least the Blue Cut train robbery in September of 1881, which made him, by any legal definition, an outlaw. He was not, by the accounts of those who knew him, a man particularly suited to the outlaw life. He was anxious by temperament. He worried about the things that life on the wrong side of the law required him not to worry about: capture, consequence, the future. He was also, perhaps for these reasons, deeply susceptible to whatever the more forceful personalities around him suggested he should do. Bob Ford was different. Bob Ford was 20 years old in the spring of 1882, the youngest of the Ford brothers involved in the events of that April, and by most accounts the one who had done the most careful thinking about his situation and his options. He was not a large man. He was not physically impressive. Contemporary descriptions of Bob Ford emphasize his youth, his smallish build, his somewhat ordinary appearance. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room and not be noticed, which was, under the circumstances, a significant practical asset. But Bob Ford was also ambitious in a way that sits uneasily alongside his youth. He had come of age in the shadow of Jesse James's legend, in a part of Missouri where that legend was inescapable, and there is something in his subsequent behavior that suggests he had spent a long time thinking about what it would mean to be the man who ended that legend. Whether that ambition was primarily about money, or about the fame that would attach to the act, or about some more complicated mixture of motives that included genuine belief in the justice of removing Jesse James from the world, is something that historians have debated for generations and that Bob Ford himself was never entirely consistent about when he described it. What is clear is that by early 1882, Bob Ford had made his decision. He had approached law enforcement authorities and made his arrangement with Governor Crittenden's administration. He had agreed, in broad terms, to deliver Jesse James. And he had accepted Charlie, his nervous elder brother, as his partner in this. Charlie's position in the household on Lafayette Street was essential. It gave Bob access. It gave both of them the proximity they needed. What must those weeks inside the house have been like for Charlie Ford? He was sleeping in a room just above the room where a man he had ridden with, a man who had trusted him enough to invite him into his home and share his plans and his daily life, was sleeping with his family. He was eating at the same table. He was talking about the upcoming bank robbery as though he intended to participate in it. And all the while he was carrying the knowledge that the arrangement with the governor existed, that the plan was in motion, that he and his brother had agreed to betray the man who was passing the butter across the breakfast table. The human weight of that situation is worth considering slowly. Not to excuse what the Fords did, not to romanticize it, but to understand it as a fully human experience rather than a simple transaction. Charlie Ford, by the accounts that survive, was not comfortable in those weeks. He drank more than usual. He slept badly. He made small mistakes in conversation, said things that needed to be quickly walked back or explained away. Jesse noticed. Jesse noticed everything, and he noticed the particular quality of unease that Charlie was carrying, though he seems to have attributed it to ordinary nerves about the upcoming robbery rather than to anything more specific. Jesse James, in those last weeks, was also carrying a weight. He was carrying the accumulated weight of 16 years of flight, of names that were not his own, of friends who had died or been captured or drifted away, of the narrowing world that a life spent as a fugitive inevitably produces. He was 34 years old, which is not old, but he had lived those 34 years with a particular intensity that does not preserve a man. The lung damage from his old wounds still troubled him. He was lean, probably thinner than he had been in his guerrilla years, and the photographs that survive from this period show a face that is alert and watchful in a way that looks not so much like caution as like exhaustion. He wanted it to be over. He said this to people, in different ways, in the weeks before April. He talked about the Platte City robbery as though it were a final act. He talked about moving somewhere with his family where he could live without looking over his shoulder. Whether he truly believed this was possible, whether he could imagine a version of himself that was not Jesse James the outlaw, is one of those questions that the historical record cannot fully answer. It may be that he could not. It may be that the myth had so thoroughly consumed the man that even Jesse James himself could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. What is certain is that on the evening of Sunday, the 3rd of April, 1882, Jesse James was at home on Lafayette Street with his wife, his 2 children, Charlie Ford and Bob Ford, who had arrived that afternoon. They had supper together. They talked about the Platte City plan. Jesse read the newspaper. The children went to bed. And somewhere in the interval between that quiet Sunday evening and the Monday morning that followed, whatever remained unresolved in the lives of all 5 of those people moved, irrevocably, toward its conclusion. Part 5, the morning of April the 4th. The morning arrived the way April mornings arrive in Missouri, gradually, with a pale light that spreads across the eastern sky long before the sun actually clears the horizon, turning the clouds above the river from gray to pink to the particular soft gold of a spring morning. The birds had been awake for some time before the household stirred. Jesse James woke early, as he usually did. Old habits from years of sleeping in fields and barns and strange rooms had made him a light sleeper who rarely needed to be woken. He dressed in the darkness, moving quietly to avoid disturbing Z, who was still asleep. He wore what he usually wore, a dark suit, a white shirt. He had, in St. Joseph, been making a point of dressing like a respectable businessman, which Thomas Howard, the wheat farmer, presumably was. There was something specific about that morning that multiple accounts mention. Jesse James was not wearing his guns. This detail has attracted a great deal of attention over the years, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Jesse James not wearing his guns was not entirely unusual inside his own house. He had 2 pistols that he typically carried, worn in a particular way, and inside the relative security of his home he would sometimes set them aside. But on the morning of April the 4th, the fact that his guns were not on his body when the final moment arrived would become one of the most discussed elements of the story that followed. Bob and Charlie Ford were also awake early. The 3 men had breakfast together, or at least the accounts suggest they ate that morning before the events that followed. The kitchen would have smelled of wood smoke from the stove, of coffee, perhaps of bacon or cornbread. The sounds of the house would have been those of any household on an ordinary morning, the small domestic percussion of cups and plates, the fire settling in the grate, the muffled sounds of children stirring upstairs. After breakfast, Jesse read the newspaper. The Missouri newspapers of April 1882 were full of various stories, and there are accounts suggesting that Jesse read and commented on several items. One story, which various sources mention, was about a man named Dick Little, a former gang member who had recently surrendered to authorities and turned state's evidence. Little's testimony was potentially devastating to several people connected to the James gang, and Jesse's reaction to reading about it that morning is described in different ways by different sources. Some say he was angry, some say he was quiet and contemplative. The morning moved through its ordinary phases. Z was busy with the children and with household tasks. Charlie Ford and Bob Ford remained in the house. At some point in the mid-morning hours, Jessie decided to do something that needed doing. There was a picture on the parlor wall, a framed needlework piece or, in some accounts, a framed picture of a racehorse that had been hanging crookedly. Jessie decided to straighten it. This is the moment that every telling of this story arrives at eventually. It is one of the most discussed, most analyzed, most mythologized moments in all of American outlaw history. Jesse James climbed on a chair, or stepped up onto a small chair that stood near the wall, to reach the picture and adjust it on its hook. He had to reach up with both hands to do this. And in doing so, he turned his back on the room, on the two men who stood behind him. The room would have been quiet in those seconds. Outside, the spring morning was going about its business. A cow lowed somewhere down the hill. A wagon went by on the street below. Inside the parlor of the White House on Lafayette Street, a man stood on a chair with his arms raised, doing something as mundane and domestic as straightening a picture on a wall. Bob Ford drew his revolver. What happened in the second before he fired is something that has been described and analyzed and argued over for 140 years. Bob Ford's own account changed in small ways over the years, as accounts given under pressure and for public audiences tend to do. Charlie Ford's account largely corroborated his brother's but was given with a quality of evident distress that some observers noted. What all accounts agree on is the basic sequence. Jesse's back was turned, Bob Ford drew his weapon and fired a single shot, and Jesse James fell from the chair to the floor. The bullet entered behind Jesse's right ear and came out through his forehead. He was almost certainly dead before he reached the floor. The sound of the shot in that small room would have been enormous. In a confined space, a pistol discharge is not just sound. It is concussion. It is smoke. It is, for a moment, total sensory confusion. Z. James, who was in another part of the house, came running toward the sound. The children, frightened by the noise, were somewhere in the house. Charlie Ford, standing nearby, may have been holding his own weapon, though whether he had drawn it before or after the shot is unclear. Z. James found her husband on the floor of the parlor. She went to him, kneeling, and in the accounts that survive from her later life, she spoke of that moment with a clarity and a grief that time did not diminish. Jesse was gone. The wound was such that there was no question of it. Thomas Howard had ceased to exist in the same instant that Jesse James had. Bob Ford went to a telegraph office later that morning. He sent a message to Sheriff James Timberlake and then to Governor Crittenden's office. The message said something to the effect that he had killed Jesse James. He signed it with his own name. Within hours, St. Joseph was no longer a quiet city going about its spring business. It was something else entirely. Part 6: The Afternoon and the Verification. News in 1882 did not travel the way news travels now. There was no instant broadcast, no photographs sent around the world in seconds, no live report from outside the house on Lafayette Street. There was the telegraph. There were the afternoon newspapers being set and printed even as the news was still arriving. There were men on horseback and men on foot, and the particular velocity of a story that everyone in a city immediately understands to be important. The news spread through St. Joseph in the way that significant news spreads through a city even now, in the moments before any official announcement, person to person, building to building, with the story changing slightly in each telling and the core fact remaining constant. Jesse James had been shot in a house on Lafayette Street. Jesse James was dead. Come and see. The verification process that followed the shooting was itself a remarkable piece of history, both because of its thoroughness and because of what it reveals about the anxiety everyone involved felt about getting this particular identification wrong. The prospect of announcing his death and being wrong was, for Governor Crittenden's administration, genuinely terrifying. Getting it wrong would be worse than not getting him at all. It would make the governor, who had staked considerable political capital on the project of ending the James gang's operations, look both incompetent and foolish. And so the identification process that unfolded on that April afternoon was careful and extensive. The body was taken from the house and moved to the office of the Seidenfaden Funeral Home, which is still remembered as part of St. Joseph's history. There, Jesse James's body was examined by a series of witnesses, each of whom was brought in specifically because their identification would carry weight. Among those who came to identify the body were several of Jesse's former associates, men who had ridden with him or known him personally and who could testify with authority that the dead man was indeed Jesse James. Among them was a man named Dick Little himself, the former gang member who had surrendered to authorities and whose recent testimony Jesse had read about in the newspaper that very morning. Little looked at the body and confirmed the identification without hesitation. There were also law officers who had studied descriptions of Jesse James for years, who knew the identifying marks that distinguished him. The tip of the middle finger of his left hand was missing, lost to an accidental gunshot wound years earlier. He had a scar on his chest from the wartime wound that had nearly killed him in 1865. He had blue eyes and a beard. All of these details matched the man lying on the undertaker's table. Perhaps most movingly, Zerelda Samuel, Jesse's mother, traveled to St. Joseph to confirm that the dead man was her son. She was by then in her late 50s, a large, commanding woman who wore her Confederate sympathies openly and who had always been the most fierce and vocal defender of her son's reputation. She came to the undertaker's and she looked at her son's body and she confirmed that it was him. And in those accounts that record her behavior in those hours, there is something in the quality of her grief and her fury that is deeply human and deeply particular. She was not only a mother identifying a dead child. She was also the keeper of a story, and she understood, even in those first terrible hours, that the story was now entering a new phase. Jesse James dead was going to become something different from Jesse James alive. The legend, which had served him in life as both shield and prison, was now going to take on a new character. It was going to become pure myth, pure romance, pure story, uncomplicated by the necessity of the actual man continuing to do actual things in the actual world. The photographs taken of Jesse James's body that afternoon in St. Joseph are among the most widely reproduced images in American outlaw history. They show a bearded man of slight build, lying on what appears to be a board or table, with his eyes closed and his face in the particular repose of death. The wound is visible in the photographs, though the images of the era were not capable of the kind of clinical detail that modern photography would provide. He looks, in those photographs, younger than 34. He looks, in a way that is difficult to articulate, almost peaceful. By evening, the news had gone out on the telegraph wires to every major city in the country. By the next morning, newspapers from New York to San Francisco were printing the story. Jesse James was dead. Shot from behind, in his own house, by two men he had trusted. Shot while straightening a picture on a wall. The specific circumstances of the death, once they became known, immediately began to do something to the legend. They began, paradoxically, to expand it rather than diminish it. Because the story of Jesse James dying at the hand of a trusted companion, dying unarmed, dying in a moment of domestic tranquility, was a story that rhymed with other stories the culture already knew. It was a betrayal story. It was a Judas story. It was the kind of story that a deeply storytelling culture, one shaped by the Bible and by Shakespeare and by the particular moral grammar of the American frontier, knew how to receive and knew how to tell and knew, almost instinctively, how to be outraged by. Bob Ford, who had expected to be a hero, was about to discover something unexpected about the nature of American sympathy. Part 7: The Ballad Before the Body Was Cold. One of the strangest things about the death of Jesse James is how quickly it became a story about the wrong it represented, even among people who had spent years living in fear of him or who had lost property or loved ones to his crimes. The transformation was not universal, and it was not uniform, but it was remarkably swift. Within days of the shooting, something that had not existed 48 hours earlier was taking shape across the cultural landscape of Missouri and beyond, a version of the story in which Jesse James was the victim and Bob Ford was the villain. This transformation was fed by several things. The manner of the death was one. Being shot from behind, by a man you trusted, in your own home, while unarmed, is not a death that invites comfortable moral categories. It is not a death that anyone, even the firmest believer in the justice of bringing Jesse James to account, could straightforwardly call fair. And fairness, even rough frontier fairness, was something the American moral imagination of 1882 took seriously. The circumstances also played into pre-existing narratives about the James family and their relationship to the law that John Newman Edwards had been constructing in his newspaper writing for years. Edwards published a famous editorial shortly after the shooting in which he wrote, with his characteristic rhetorical intensity, that Jesse James had been killed not by a man but by a coward, not by a blow but by a betrayal, and that the real crime of the morning was not Jesse's robberies but the manner of his killing. Edwards called Bob Ford the dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard. This phrase, or some version of it, would eventually find its way into the folk ballad that would become one of the most famous pieces of American vernacular music ever written. The Ballad of Jesse James, in the versions that circulated most widely, begins with a stanza that tells you the speaker's sympathies immediately. Jesse James was a man who killed many a man. He robbed the Glendale train. He stole from the rich and he gave to the poor. He had a hand and a heart and a brain. Whether or not any of this was literally true, whether Jesse James actually gave money to the poor in any systematic or meaningful way, is largely beside the point. The ballad is not a historical document. It is a cultural argument. It is the community speaking its preference for what the story ought to mean. Bob Ford's experience of his own act in the days and weeks after April the 4th is one of the more poignant elements of this entire story. He had done something that he believed would make him famous and make him wealthy, and it did make him famous, in a way, but not quite in the way he had imagined. The trial, which was remarkably swift, saw Bob and Charlie Ford charged with first-degree murder. They pleaded guilty. They were sentenced to hang. And then, within hours of the sentencing, Governor Crittenden issued a pardon for both of them. The speed of the pardon made clear what everyone had suspected: this had been arranged. The governor had known. The killing was not exactly the spontaneous act of a private citizen delivering a dangerous fugitive to justice. It was something closer to an assassination arranged by the state, conducted by proxies who could be disowned if necessary but who were not, in the event, disowned at all. The pardon itself became a political controversy. Crittenden's critics, who had been numerous and vocal, now had exactly the material they needed. The governor had hired a man to kill Jesse James, they said. He had funded the reward with money that exceeded legal limits. He had pardoned the killers before the ink on the death sentence was dry. Whether one thought Jesse James deserved to die or not, the process by which he had been killed raised uncomfortable questions about the difference between law enforcement and extra-legal violence conducted under the cover of state authority. Bob Ford took his pardon and tried to make a life with what he had done. He gave lectures about the killing of Jesse James. He appeared in stage performances in which he reenacted the scene in the parlor on Lafayette Street. He toured with theatrical companies. He was stared at in restaurants and spoken to in tones that were difficult to interpret as straightforwardly admiring. He drank. He moved from place to place. He was, in the years after April 1882, a man who had done a famous thing and discovered that fame of that particular kind is not quite what the word usually promises. The song followed him everywhere. The dirty little coward who shot Mr. Howard. Wherever he went, people knew who he was and what he had done, and the cultural verdict on what he had done had been largely rendered by the ballad before he had time to make his own case. He died in 1892, 10 years after the shooting, shot in a saloon in Creede, Colorado by a man named Edward O'Kelly. His killer was something of a celebrity in his own right, as the man who had killed the man who had killed Jesse James. The layers of legend were already accumulating. Charlie Ford, the elder brother, the nervous one who had slept in the room above the parlor and eaten at the table and carried the terrible knowledge through those final weeks, did not fare even as well as Bob. He fell into depression and alcoholism in the years after the shooting, plagued, by many accounts, by the weight of what he had been part of. He died in 1884, 2 years after the shooting. His death was by his own hand. He was 24 years old. Part 8, Z and the Children. There is a story inside the larger story of the death of Jesse James that receives less attention than it deserves, and it is the story of Zerelda Mims James, known as Z, and her 2 children. It is the story of what happened to the family that was left in the house on Lafayette Street after the men with official purposes had come and gone. Z. James was 29 years old when her husband was killed in her parlor. She had been married to him for 8 years, years spent in constant movement, in rented houses under assumed names, in the particular kind of watchful vigilance that being a fugitive's wife required. She had watched her husband be nervous and watchful and sometimes frightening, and she had watched him be gentle and attentive with their children, and she had watched him read the newspaper at the breakfast table on a spring morning, and then she had heard a gunshot and run toward it and found everything changed. The immediate practical situation was severe. The family had very little money. Whatever Jesse had accumulated from the gang's activities, and it had never been as much as the legend suggested, since the costs of living as a fugitive, of moving frequently, of keeping horses and buying silence and maintaining the infrastructure of a life spent on the run, were considerable, there was not a substantial inheritance for Z to draw on. She had the household goods. She had some horses. She had a husband's body that the city of St. Joseph and the state of Missouri regarded as a matter of public interest and which attracted immediate attention from people who wanted to photograph it, examine it, display it, and charge admission to see it. The body of Jesse James became, within days of the shooting, a commercial enterprise. It was put on display at the Seidenfaden Funeral Home, where thousands of St. Joseph residents came to view it. The queue of people waiting to see the body of Jesse James stretched down the street and around the corner. The price of admission has been cited in various sources, and whether there actually was a formal admission charge or simply donations accepted at the door varies somewhat by account, but the essential fact is clear: Jesse James was more commercially valuable dead than he had been alive. Z. James eventually secured her husband's body and had it transported back to Clay County for burial. The burial took place at the farm where Jesse had grown up, at Kearney, Missouri, in a grave in the yard that his mother Zerelda could see from the farmhouse window, because she had insisted he be buried close enough to protect him from grave robbers, which was not an idle concern in an era when the graves of famous men were routinely disturbed by those seeking souvenirs or seeking to disprove the death. Z. James returned to Kansas City, where she lived with her children and tried to rebuild some version of a life. She never remarried. She lived quietly, working as a seamstress in some periods, accepting what support was offered by the network of James family connections and sympathizers in Missouri. She watched the legend of her husband grow and shift and elaborate itself in the years after his death, watched the dime novels and the theatrical productions and eventually the penny press stories, and she maintained, through all of it, a quiet dignity that the available historical record consistently notes. Jesse Edward James, the son, grew up to be a lawyer. He spent a significant portion of his adult life engaged with his father's legacy in legal and historical terms, representing family interests in matters relating to the estate and to the endless stream of impostors, self-proclaimed Jesse Jameses, who emerged in the decades after the shooting to claim that the man killed in St. Joseph had not really been Jesse James at all. This phenomenon, the impostors, deserves a brief mention here, because it is one of the stranger tributaries of this river of history. In the years following the shooting, a number of men came forward at various points to claim that they were the real Jesse James, that the man who had been buried in the Kearney farmyard was someone else, that the real Jesse had faked his death and escaped. The most famous of these claimants was a man named J. Frank Dalton, who emerged in the 1940s, decades after the shooting, claiming to be Jesse James at the advanced age of either 90-something or over 100, depending on which version of his story he was telling. Dalton attracted considerable attention and performed the old Jesse James role with some relish before his claims were comprehensively and repeatedly dismissed by everyone with access to the actual historical record. Mary Susan James, the daughter, Jesse's little girl who was 5 years old on the morning of April the 4th, lived a long life. She died in 1935, more than 50 years after that morning in St. Joseph. She did not speak publicly about her father as extensively as her brother did, and the contours of her inner life remain largely private. But she was there, that morning. She was upstairs when the shot was fired. She heard her mother cry out. She was 5 years old. What does it do to a child, to be that close to the abrupt end of a parent's life? To grow up carrying that morning as one of the foundational memories of your existence? These are not questions that the historical record can fully answer. They are questions that sit alongside the history and remind us that the story of the death of Jesse James was not only a matter of politics and law and legend. It was also a family's loss. It was, in the most direct and irreducible terms, the death of a husband and a father in his own home, in a room where his children played. Part 9: The Legend After the Man. In the years and decades that followed April 1882, something remarkable and quite predictable happened to the story of Jesse James. It grew. It elaborated. It multiplied. It found expression in every medium available to American popular culture, and as those mediums multiplied and became more powerful, the story grew correspondingly larger and more complex. The dime novels came first. These were the paperback genre fiction of the Victorian era, cheap, quickly produced, widely distributed, and utterly unencumbered by any obligation to historical accuracy. Jesse James appeared in dime novels within months of his death, and the Jesse James of those novels was a figure who shared a name and certain broad biographical facts with the man who had lived on Lafayette Street, but who had been substantially reimagined for the entertainment requirements of the genre. These stories were enormously popular. They sold in the hundreds of thousands. They were read by people who had never been within 1,000 miles of Missouri, by people in the cities of the East Coast and the mill towns of New England and the immigrant communities of the Midwest, all of whom apparently found something compelling and familiar in the shape of the story. The noble outlaw is one of the oldest recurring figures in Western storytelling, from Robin Hood to Rob Roy to Ned Kelly, and Jesse James slipped into that tradition with an ease that suggests how ready the template was and how precisely the specific historical circumstances of his life had shaped him to fit it. The theatrical productions followed the dime novels. Traveling companies performed Jesse James plays across the American Midwest and South, sometimes billing themselves with remarkable audacity as productions featuring real former members of the James Gang or individuals who had personal knowledge of the events portrayed. Some of these claims were true in a limited sense. Others were pure invention. The audiences generally did not distinguish between the two with any great rigor, because they were not coming for documentary accuracy. They were coming for the story. The silent films began in the early 20th century, and Jesse James was among the first historical figures to be depicted on screen. The films varied in their approach, some more historically grounded than others, but the general shape of the story they told was consistent with the dime novel tradition: Jesse as hero, the railroads as villains, the Civil War as context and explanation, the betrayal by Ford as the central dramatic event of the narrative. The 1939 film starring Tyrone Power as Jesse James and Henry Fonda as Frank James was for many decades the definitive Hollywood treatment of the subject. It was a lavish production, beautifully photographed, with the golden light of the late Hollywood studio system falling on a Missouri that looked more like a romantic pastoral than like the actual landscape of Clay and Ray counties. The historical liberties it took were considerable, but it told the story with a conviction and a warmth that made it genuinely affecting, and it introduced the Jesse James legend to a new generation of Americans who had not grown up in the shadow of the original events. The folk music tradition, which had given the world the Jesse James ballad within months of his death, continued to produce work that engaged with the legend across the decades. Woody Guthrie referenced Jesse James. Later musicians in the folk revival of the 1950s and 1960s treated the ballad as part of the essential American repertoire, alongside John Henry and Stagger Lee and other figures from the tradition of American vernacular heroism. What all of these cultural productions have in common, from the dime novels to the films to the folk songs, is that they are all, in one way or another, arguments. Arguments about what Jesse James meant. Arguments about the Civil War and its aftermath. Arguments about the relationship between the individual and the state, about the moral status of rebellion, about whether a man who breaks the law for comprehensible human reasons is categorically different from a man who breaks it for mere greed. The historical record is considerably more ambiguous on these questions than the legend prefers. The actual Jesse James killed people. He killed, by credible historical accounts, at least 2 or 3 people directly in robberies or confrontations, and the gang he led killed others. Some of these victims were innocent bystanders. Some were working men doing their jobs on trains that the gang robbed, men who had no more connection to the railroad's ownership or policies than anyone else doing ordinary employment. The actual Jesse James did not demonstrably give money to the poor in any systematic way. The actual Jesse James was, by any reasonable definition, a dangerous criminal who remained dangerous for 16 years and who caused real harm to real people. But the historical record is also more human than the legend sometimes allows. The actual Jesse James was a man shaped by specific historical forces, by the trauma of guerrilla warfare during his most formative years, by the experience of being on the losing side of a catastrophic conflict, by a political and social environment that left him and men like him with limited options for any kind of legitimate life in the immediate post-war years. He was not a simple monster. He was not a simple hero. He was a man. And the persistent cultural fascination with his story may be, at its deepest level, a fascination with precisely that complexity. The house on Lafayette Street has been a museum since 1939. More than 2 million people have walked through its 5 rooms in the decades since it opened to the public. They look at the chair, at the wall, at the spot on the floor, and they try to imagine the moment, and in imagining it they are also, without necessarily being conscious of it, asking themselves the same questions that the ballads and the dime novels and the films have always been asking. What does it mean to live outside the law? What is owed to a man who has done wrong for understandable reasons? Where is the line between justice and betrayal? And what becomes of a legend when the man at its center is gone? Part 10: The Governor and His Bargain. There is a figure in this story who tends to stand somewhat in the background of the main narrative, mentioned as context and then moved past, and that figure deserves more careful attention than he usually receives. Thomas Crittenden, governor of Missouri from 1881 to 1885, is in many ways the central architect of what happened on the morning of April 4, 1882, and his own story illuminates the event in ways that neither the Jesse James legend nor the Ford brothers story quite manages on its own. Crittenden was a Democrat, a former Union officer in the Civil War, a lawyer by training, and a politician by disposition. He had won the governorship in 1880 on a platform that included a fairly explicit commitment to bringing Jesse James to justice, or to an end, with the ambiguity of that phrasing being somewhat intentional. The James Gang's continuing operations were an embarrassment to Missouri, or at least that was the argument Crittenden and others made, and there is real substance to it. Missouri's reputation as a state where organized outlawry could operate with apparent impunity for 16 years was damaging to its commercial and political standing. The specific mechanism that Crittenden used to fund the reward for Jesse James's capture or death was legally creative in ways that his critics found troubling. The Missouri state legislature had a cap on rewards that the governor could offer. The amount Crittenden wished to offer, $10,000 each for Jesse and Frank James, was well above that cap. Crittenden's solution was to approach the railroad and express companies directly and ask them to fund the reward privately, with the state's endorsement and the implicit authority of the governor's office behind it. This arrangement, even by the standards of 1882, was ethically murky. It meant that private corporations with a direct financial interest in the outcome were funding a quasi-governmental operation that would result in either the capture or the killing of a private citizen. The distinction between this and simply hiring private killers was not as clear as Crittenden's defenders would have liked, and his critics made that point repeatedly both before and after the shooting. The pardon that Crittenden issued for the Ford brothers within hours of their sentencing was the most politically explosive element of the whole sequence. The governor had clearly been in communication with the Fords or their representatives before the shooting. The pardon had been essentially prearranged. What the Fords had done was done with the governor's foreknowledge and implicit sanction. This put Crittenden in a position that he spent the rest of his political career, and indeed the rest of his life, defending. His argument was straightforward. Jesse James was a dangerous outlaw who had evaded legitimate law enforcement for 16 years and who represented a genuine threat to public order and commerce in Missouri. The methods required to end that threat were unconventional, but the end justified the means. Jesse James was dead. Missouri was safer. The railroad companies were satisfied. The express companies were satisfied. Order had been restored. His critics' argument was also straightforward, and it drew on a moral vocabulary that many Missourians found more compelling than Crittenden's utilitarian calculus. You arranged the killing of a man. You used state authority to sanction what was, in practice, an assassination. You funded it with money from the very corporations that Jesse James had been robbing, giving those corporations a direct financial incentive in a man's death. You pardoned the killers before they had spent a single night in a cell. Whatever Jesse James was, whatever crimes he had committed, this is not what justice looks like. Crittenden did not seek re-election and did not win a subsequent significant political office. Whether this was directly attributable to the controversy surrounding the death of Jesse James or simply to the normal rhythms of Missouri politics is debated. He lived until 1909, long enough to see Jesse James become firmly established as a folk hero in the American imagination, long enough to read accounts and see theatrical productions in which he himself was portrayed as the villain of the piece rather than as a governor who had finally solved a 16-year problem. What must that have been like? To have arranged something that you believed was necessary and correct, and to watch the years pass and find the cultural judgment moving steadily in the opposite direction? To become, in the popular imagination, the man who organized the cowardly killing of Jesse James rather than the governor who finally brought a dangerous outlaw's career to an end? The governor's bargain with the Ford brothers, and through them with history, was one that he made in a specific political and historical moment, with the information available to him in that moment and under the pressures that his office and his time placed upon him. Whether it was the right bargain is a question that depends enormously on what you think the story of Jesse James was really about, and on which version of Jesse James you find most persuasive, the dangerous criminal who needed to be stopped, or the symbol of a defeated people's refusal to give up their story. The governor, whatever his failings, understood one thing clearly, that symbols can be as dangerous as men. And that the most dangerous kind of symbol is one that is still alive. Part 11, What Remains? There is a quality to the aftermath of a great story that is always, in some measure, a question about inheritance. Who inherits the meaning of what happened? Who has the right to say what it meant? Who gets to decide how it is remembered? In the case of Jesse James and the morning of April 4, 1882, the answers to those questions have shifted across 140 years, and they continue to shift, which is itself a measure of how much the story still matters to people, how much it still functions as an argument about things that remain unresolved in American life. The physical remnants of the story are scattered across Missouri. The farmhouse in Kearney where Jesse James was born still stands and is open to visitors. The grave in the farmyard, though Jesse's remains were eventually exhumed and moved to the Mount Olivet Cemetery in Kearney, is still a point of pilgrimage for people who feel the pull of the story. The house on Lafayette Street in St. Joseph still stands and still receives visitors throughout the year. St. Joseph itself has changed enormously since 1882. The city that existed then, the river port and railroad hub that sat on the edge of the Great Plains and looked west toward the territories, has been transformed by 140 years of industrial and post-industrial change. The Missouri River still moves below the bluffs, but the city above it is different in almost every visible respect from the city that existed in the spring of 1882. And yet the house on Lafayette Street maintains a particular quality of stillness that visitors to it consistently remark upon. The rooms are small, and they are quiet, and when you stand in the parlor and look at the approximate area where the chair would have stood, there is something in the silence of the place that seems to press back at you. Not dramatically. Not with any of the manufactured atmosphere of a tourist attraction. Simply with the particular weight of a place where something irrevocable happened. The historiography of Jesse James, the scholarly writing about who he actually was and what his career actually meant, has grown considerably more sophisticated in the decades since the early Romantic accounts written by contemporaries and sympathizers. Historians like T.J. Stiles, whose biography of Jesse James published in 2002 represents perhaps the most rigorous and comprehensive scholarly treatment of the subject, have worked to disentangle the man from the myth, to locate him in the specific historical circumstances that produced him, and to assess his career without either the romanticization of the legend or the simple condemnation that the legend tends to elicit as a reaction. What emerges from that more rigorous scholarship is a picture that is, in some ways, less satisfying than the legend but considerably more interesting. Jesse James was not a Robin Hood. He was not a noble rebel. He was a man shaped by the most violent and traumatic event in American history, a man who had spent his most formative years in a world defined by killing and betrayal and the complete suspension of normal moral order, and who had never fully been able to leave that world behind even when the war itself was over. He was also, it is worth saying, a man who was genuinely skilled at the particular life he had chosen or fallen into. The 16 years of the James Gang's operations, the degree to which they eluded law enforcement, continue from exactly where the script left off. Begin mid-sentence if needed, then complete part 11, write part 12 in full, write the closing meditation in full, and then write the. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.